Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Rust on Rust on the Radio on Freedom 95, broadcasting at 9:50 a.m. and 95.9 FM on your radio dial, broadcasting all across the beautiful fruited plain of Indiana, as Rush Limbaugh used to say. I love that term, fruited plain. I am in the studio today, folks, with the redneck Republican, Justin. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Thank you so much, John. I'm always happy to come on and talk Indiana politics.
And we have a lot of Indiana politics to talk about today. But first and foremost, folks, I want to take a victory lap. Right now, the gasoline tax and sales tax on gasoline in the state of Indiana is on hold. And I think that is 100% due to my billboards saying axe the gas tax and this radio show where we have been speaking the truth and shaming the devil on how Indiana has the fifth highest gasoline tax in the country. That's unconscionable. A red state, a ruby red state. Why on earth we have such a high gasoline tax? So, folks, Governor Braun axed the gas tax temporarily, and guess what? Indiana now has the lowest gasoline price in the country, according to WayneTV.com. Isn't that fantastic? That's a victory for all Hoosiers. So thank you for listening. Thank you for making your voices heard so that our career politicians in Indianapolis heard you loud and clear that we needed gas tax relief because, of course, the Iran war has pushed gasoline prices to, record highs lately, unfortunately. But thanks to the gasoline tax, which is totally unnecessary, being temporarily suspended, now we have the lowest gasoline price in the country. That, folks, is where Indiana should be. Guess what? We have a projected $5 billion, with a B, billion-dollar budget surplus in the state of Indiana. So we absolutely do not need the gas tax. The gas tax collects $50 million a month. We have more than enough money to fund our roads at a wonderful level. Instead, the politicians were using that money to fund stuff like the IEDC or the Bears Stadium up in Chicago. That's great. I hope we get the Chicago Bears, but I think they should rename themselves the Indiana Bears if we're going to be using taxpayer dollars for it. If Indiana taxpayers are on the hook for it, it absolutely should be a branding opportunity for Indiana, not Chicago. They're not going to be paying for it. We're the ones going to be paying for it. And so, folks, the story on that is Governor Braun has talked about using toll road money that's already being collected along the toll roads in northern Indiana to subsidize building roads for the new Chicago Bears Stadium that may be proposed in Hammond, Indiana.
I 100% agree with you, John, that it absolutely needs to be rebranded. Because there's no sense in if it's
Indiana taxpayer dollars, it needs to be the Indiana Bears.
Exactly,
in my opinion, or the Hoosier Bears. I like the Hoosier Bears better. Let's make it the Hoosier Bears.
I like that because that way it's not too because Indianapolis with the Colts is a little bit too similar. So I do kind of like Hoosier.
Yeah, the Hoosier Bears. I think that's awesome. And if we're paying for it as taxpayers, we should have the right to name it. So it should be the Hoosier Bears, not the Chicago Bears, especially if we are being forced to pay for it, right?
Exactly. And I want to backtrack a little bit back to the gas tax. I want to point out I feel like it's extremely disheartening that it took an entire war for our state government to realize that the gas tax is unnecessary and hurting Hoosiers for no reason. I mean, I'm not trying to be too doom and gloom over here.
Well, they're financial predators. Rob Kendall says this. The Indiana establishment, GOP, they are in it for the kill of Indiana taxpayers. They just sit there dreaming of ways to get more tax revenue from working Hoosiers. The toll roads, that is unconscionable that we have a Indiana state legislature that just last year authorized tolls for every mile of Indiana interstate. Again, we are a red state. We are a ruby red state. That is unconscionable that we are proposing to toll all those roads. And folks, the toll to drive from Richmond to Terre Haute on I-70, as I understand it, would be about $10.
I mean, that's just absolutely ridiculous.
One way. And so if you extrapolate that toll, if you're going to be driving from Seymour to Indianapolis, for instance, to go to work, you're going to be paying, $7 or $8 each way. So that's, $15 a day.
Exactly.
Folks, no, absolutely not. We have more than enough money rolling into the Indiana State Treasury today. But unfortunately, our government just loves to tax and they love to spend.
You say, but you said many times, and it's true. Indiana is a ruby red state. Indiana is a barn red state. I think we have to specify that a little bit more. The citizens and the grassroots of Indiana are a barn red and ruby red state, but the establishment politicians in Indiana govern just like deep blue liberals. I mean, it's just the way it is. Again, the difference is clear. It's not the grassroots. It's not the actual citizens of the state. Like you said, they're conservative, ruby red, but it's our government that decided to govern like liberals.
No, and I believe our delegates are conservative. Our delegates are the grassroots, folks.
Exactly.
The problem is the party bigwigs have to force candidates on the delegates this year it will be in Fort Wayne at the convention, and not give them any choice. Unfortunately, there is no choice for state treasurer or state controller. Those are all just, being party ordained. Yes, the incumbent is great. We don't need anyone else in there. So no opposition allowed, even though there is a lot of questions on what's happening with Indiana taxpayer money being invested, and we're going to get into this later in the show, in Israel and in Illinois, of all places, a failed state. Why on earth is Indiana investing state money in Illinois? What's up with that? But, folks, the first story that I want to get into today and do a deep dive on is the Diego Morales saga, the Diego Morales Secretary of State saga here in the state of Indiana. So, folks, Diego Morales had the endorsements of Todd Rokita and Jim Banks, and the state party establishment was just saying it has to be Diego. No other candidate should be allowed. And they actually put pressure on David Shelton recently to get out of the race so that Diego would run unopposed at the convention. Did you know that, Justin?
I did know that.
He was offered a job in the election division that actually paid more than what the Indiana Secretary of State job is paid. He would have had a $20,000 increase in his salary, but he turned that down. And folks, you know why David Shelton turned that down? He said that earlier this week on the Rob Kendall show. I can't be bought. I can't be paid off. I will always do right for Hoosiers. That's the kind of person we need in the Indiana Secretary of State's office. Someone who will work for Hoosiers, not the party elites. And that's my big problem with this male model that was thrown into the race by Jim Banks. What's his name? Max Engling?
I like to call him Establishment Engling.
Establishment Engling, okay. The male model who worked in the Jim Banks office. Well, I wonder what his job there was. I guess he was a model for Jim Banks. I don't know. We'll get into Engling later, but first, folks, there was massive pressure put on Diego Morales to actually resign from office by Daniel Elliott and by Jim Banks and Todd Rokita for Diego to actually withdraw from the race for Secretary of State. But Diego's realized, and I'll speak pretty bluntly on this, I think figuratively, they had him put in the back of the trunk, and they were taking him out to bury him in a cornfield somewhere. Figuratively, folks, not really. But if you ever saw the movie Casino, I think in the back of his mind, Diego was like, hey, wait a second. They're going to bury me, and I'm gone. It's figuratively, folks, figuratively. So we shall see on that. But Diego, he's not going down. I think Diego still actually has a lot of support in the Republican Party in Indiana because, folks, there's a lot of people that have no clue how unethical he has acted in office. There's a lot of people at Lincoln Day dinners who interacted with Diego at Lincoln Day dinners and was handed a paper plate at the buffet line. That's how I met Diego, was at a Lincoln Day dinner. And he handed me a plate, and we had a great conversation.
And see, that's the thing, people value those personal relationships.
And he worked his butt off going to Lincoln Day dinners for 3 years now, handing out paper plates. And I think there's a lot of people that are going to say, hey, wait a second. We're not going to let Jim Banks tell us who we have to vote for. Maybe I'll vote for Diego, or maybe I'll vote for David Shelton or Jamie Rittenauer. they're going to say, hey, wait a second, we are so sick of having the establishment candidates pulled out of the thin air like this England male model, how he was forced on Hoosiers as, the party standard bearer all of a sudden, and then, announced, in such a way that you'd wonder if he wasn't the second coming of Ronald Reagan, for being just a male model in the Jim Banks office, I guess. I don't know.
Exactly. I just want
And folks, I think his actual title was he was a state director. I don't want to belittle and say he was a male model, but I don't think he was a model in the Jim Banks office. I think he actually had a title other than model, I would presume.
Right, I believe so. But I just want to backtrack a little bit more on Diego. It's like all these establishment figures that pulled their endorsement from Diego, who had endorsed him. It's like they knew what this guy was. I mean, everybody who knew and followed Indiana politics for the past 4 years has seen everything Diego's done and has known this guy is an unethical politician.
Well,
in the entire establishment, they knew this, and they knew this when they were endorsing him. And the only reason they pulled their endorsement is because they saw that he was going to most likely lose to Beau Bayh. It's like, I want to emphasize this. The establishment GOP in Indiana they do not care about the ethical problems of Diego Morales. They only care about the electoral problems of Diego Morales.
Correct. And so, for instance, interestingly, Todd Rokita and Jim Banks, when they pulled their endorsement for Diego, they were just hoping he would disappear off into the sunset. They figuratively had him in the back of the trunk. And it was announced on the Twitterverse by several people that Diego would be withdrawing from the race.
I saw some of those.
And folks, we're going to get into that in the next segment. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So when we come back, folks, we're going to dig into more on this Diego Morales candidacy for Secretary of State. This is John Rust on Rust on the Radio on Freedom 95. We will be right back. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on Freedom 95 on The John Rust Show, broadcasting at 9:50 a.m. and 95.9 FM on your radio dial, broadcasting all across the beautiful fruited plain of Indiana. So, folks, I'm in here in the studio with Justin, the Redneck Republican. Welcome again, Justin.
Always happy to be on the show and give rednecks some representation in politics.
Well, that's what one of us are anyway.
Oh, absolutely.
I've certainly had a redneck. I've spent enough time on a tractor. I know all about that. So, folks, Diego Morales is not quitting the race, despite massive pressure from Daniel Elliott and Jim Banks and Todd Rokita, the Republican establishment, for him to just quietly slink away. And in fact, Daniel Elliott actually called for him to resign from office immediately. But Diego's saying, nope, I ain't doing that. Diego's saying, I'm going to fight this out. And, folks, Diego has $1 million still in his campaign coffer. And I think he has a lot of support from many people in the state who don't know his real story, that live in the extreme counties that have not heard about all these scandals that have plagued Diego repeatedly.
And, that's a good point, because I know, in my neck of the woods in the southeast, like Ripley County, Dearborn, Ohio, Switzerland, Jefferson, we don't get Indianapolis news stations. We get our TV out of Cincinnati and Kentucky, so we're not, like, those people aren't going to know exactly how
all they're going to
Diego's
remember
been.
is Diego, he's the one that gave me the paper plate at the Lincoln Day dinner.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
In Vivi or wherever.
Exactly. It's like they're going to look at Max Singling. Oh, who was this? David Shelton. Who was this? Jamie Rittenhouse. Who was this? It was Diego Morales who was the one who actually came and shook their hand.
So, folks, this is from a press release from Diego Morales himself. He says, fellow Hoosiers, since I announced I was running for Indiana Secretary of State in November of 2020, my goal was to give delegates the choice at the convention. I welcome more competition into this race, but that sentiment has not changed. Delegates will decide who will be the Republican nominee for Indiana Secretary of State. The decision belongs in the hands and only the hands of Republican convention delegates. I'm confident I'll be renominated. I look forward to seeing Republican delegates in Fort Wayne on June 20th. Folks, that is directly from Diego Morales. So he is not withdrawing from the race whatsoever.
And this is a situation where I kind of agree with Rob Kendall. I'm honestly kind of glad he's not letting the establishment bully him out, because they all knew what he was, even when they were endorsing him
Well,
months
they're
back.
who made him.
Exactly.
The establishment made Diego Morales, and the establishment, I guarantee you, is behind all that unethical behavior
100%.
because they all share the same donors, folks.
Exactly. Always follow the money.
Always follow the money. So back on this race, this is going to be a fascinating convention in Fort Wayne. This is from Abdul Hakim Shabazz, and he did a Twitter poll, which is not representative at all of the real political world, but it's something. And according to his poll, Max Engling leads at 37.7%. David Shelton is at 24.5%. Undecided's at 17%. Diego Morales is at 13.2%, and Jamie Rittenauer is at 7.5%. But folks, guess what? In my opinion, I think the undecideds are the ones that will actually end up voting for David Shelton. I think there's a lot of delegates that don't like being told how to vote by the establishment, and the establishment is trying to force Engling on Hoosiers. I think he's lived here before because he ran for Congress before, folks. He ran against Victoria Spartz in 2024, but he lost massively. He came in like in third or fourth place. I forget which. Also, he's just not very popular in his own precinct here in Indiana. He ran for state delegate, folks, and he lost. That's the kind of person the establishment is trying to push on delegate voters, is someone who couldn't even win the race to be a delegate. How pathetic is that?
Exactly. I said this about Diego Morales losing his delegate race. I'll say the same thing about Max Engling losing his delegate race. If his own neighbors don't trust him to just be their representation at the convention to choose the next Secretary of State, how can statewide Hoosiers trust this guy to actually be the Indiana Secretary of State?
And folks, well, if you do the math on this poll and how the state party vote will be at the convention, listen to this. Max Engling may be ahead on the first ballot, but he will not have 51%, not by a long shot. It looks to me like actually David Shelton, I think he's on the path to victory. David Shelton, if you do the math on how the votes happen, I think he will end up with 62% of the vote against the Jim Banks and Todd Rokita establishment, because these people are going to unite around a candidate who is not being forced on them. I think they're going to realize that David Shelton, he may be a boring candidate. Maybe that's the only person who can beat Beau Bayh, is someone who's actually competent at his office and doesn't just want to use the office as a stepping stone for another office or to be told what to do by the bigwigs in the Indiana GOP establishment.
Exactly. That's been the entire problem with the Indiana Secretary of State's office. It has been anything but boring. It's like, I think people, and if Beau Bayh,
I think that's why Shelton has a great shot at this.
Exactly. And see, that's the same thing with Bayh, is that if Bayh gets in there, it's also not going to be boring, because then you're going to have all the Democrats. Oh, we finally got a Democrat in. Oh, look how awesome he is. Look how young he is. Like, go in there, do the job, not be corrupt, right, and that be it. It's like, and David Shelton fits the nail on the head.
Well, folks, earlier this week, Nikki Kelly came out and pointed out something very interesting. The Diego Morales campaign is sending out campaign flyers that are just arriving this week. And he says, well, I guess the mail moves slow, I guess. But the Diego campaign, as of early this week, was still mailing out mailers that showed proudly endorsed by Jim Banks for Diego Morales. So I think what Diego's doing is reminding people that he actually had the quote-unquote Jim Banks endorsement. And then he realized, well, that means nothing. The Jim Banks endorsement will always, it will always be based on just electoral matters, never about philosophical matters. That's the problem, folks, in the Indiana GOP establishment. There's a big difference between candidates who will do the job and candidates who are there just because they think, oh, he might win. But if he does win, he will do as told by the establishment. And that's the issue I have with Max Engling, is how truly independent will he be as an Indiana Secretary of State? Is he just going to repeat Jim Banks' talking points and be there as a stalking horse for Jim Banks?
Exactly, because you got to remember, nothing is free in politics. All these establishment people like Jim Banks and Todd Rokita, and Danny Elliott, they're going to want something in return for the support they're giving Max Engling if he does in fact win
Well, and look
Secretary
who
of
paid
State.
for that Engling's filing fee. Jim Banks actually paid that. That's on the public documents.
Exactly.
And that was over $10,000.
Exactly. So that tells you all you need to know
And
about
so,
who Max Engling is going to be beholden to if elected.
well, he's going to be
Indiana
controlled
Secretary
by
of State.
Jim Banks, and I think the Indiana delegates, they're the grassroots. They're the folks, that actually choose who our candidates will be. They're going to say, hey, wait a second. I don't like being told what to do by these establishment figures, and especially Jim Banks, who votes for trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of new debt in Washington, D.C. Jim Banks, who votes for Joe Biden levels of government spending. Jim Banks, who voted for the First Step Act, which released criminals from prison early. He's a fake conservative that comes to Indiana and thumps his chest about how conservative he is, but he goes to D.C. and votes the liberal line. I want to say that again. Everyone thinks, oh, Jim Banks, he's a conservative fighter. That's baloney. I'll put it politely. He is a big government liberal. Look at all his joint letters with Elizabeth Warren, who's one of the most radical left-wing senators in the United States Senate.
I guess that's what living in Virginia does to a fella.
Well, and you have to remember Jim Banks was very firmly in the Kevin McCarthy camp. If you remember, Jim Banks voted repeatedly for Kevin McCarthy to be Speaker in 2022.
And, we all saw how that eventually turned out.
Repeatedly. And, that was a disaster. Jim Banks has incredibly poor judgment on who should be in leadership, and witnessed that with his support for John Thune. But, of course, John Thune has paid Jim Banks off to the tune of several $100,000 in direct campaign donations. Folks, of course they would push a male model on us. They just want prostitutes to be our elected leaders like Jim Banks, who will do anything for a buck, literally. Isn't that sad?
Exactly. And I want to go back, to the convention. You talked about the delegates don't like being told what to do. We have evidence of that only a couple years ago in 2024 when the delegates were choosing the nominee for lieutenant governor. Mike Braun and the rest of the GOP establishment wanted Julie McGuire. But then you also had Micah Beckwith come in there, and the delegates didn't like being told, "Oh, you're going to vote Julie McGuire." They seen Micah Beckwith, they evidently liked what he had to say,
and she had the Trump endorsement.
Exactly, she got the Trump endorsement too.
But the delegates said, "No, wait a second, we don't like being told what to do." So, folks, this is going to be extremely interesting in Fort Wayne. And I think another factor on all this but you have to realize how unpopular Jim Banks is in the Republican Party in the state of Indiana. This is from Rob Kendall. He says, just a reminder, Jim Banks is so unpopular with Republican voters, he has had a lower favorability than Todd Young in a December poll from a pro-Trump group. And his endorsed candidates don't exactly have a great track record. That's from Rob Kendall.
And that's very important because the picture that the Twitterverse tries to paint is that, oh, Jim Banks, he's the MAGA conservative fighter, and Todd Young, he's the big anti-Trump rhino.
Well, no, Jim Banks is a bootlicker, pure and simple.
Exactly. But looking back at this poll, is like this poll here is going completely against the narrative they try to push.
That's why I ran for the Senate. I can't stand these people that are in it just for the bucks, and then they get in there and they are so beholden to the dollars that they have to get down on their knees and lick the shoes of all their political donors. And that's what Jim Banks does all day long.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, folks, that's probably what Engling would do if you look at his track record of where he worked. He worked for Kevin McCarthy in Congress, as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. And, I want to point out something. Everybody talks about, how D.C. and Congress is the root of all of our problems. Well, then why would we want a guy who's worked in D.C. for the past, I don't know how many years, to then come to Indiana? Don't D.C. my Indiana. How about that?
Right. Don't Illinois, Indiana. Don't California, Indiana. Unfortunately, our GOP establishment repeatedly keeps doing that. Folks, is it too much to ask for Indiana elected officers to be actual native Hoosiers? David Shelton's a native Hoosier. He's lived here all his life. This Engling guy he's from Illinois, I believe. He was just dropped in on us, but only because he works for the Banks campaign in D.C., I guess. I don't know on
I'll
that.
tell you what, Indiana must be one of the best states there is out there. You've got Jim Banks, who lives in Virginia but pretends to live here. England, who does the same thing.
Well, Jim Banks is really Virginia's third senator.
Exactly. That's what he votes like it too.
He votes like it, and he's lived there for several years now, unfortunately. Isn't that crazy?
Mm-hmm.
No matter what you think of Todd Young, folks, he does live in the state of Indiana, and he comes back here on weekends. Jim Banks stays in Virginia, unless he gets flown in for a Lincoln Day dinner. And he will pop out and immediately rush up to the bigwigs in the local party. But if you're grassroots, you ain't going to meet him. No.
And unless you got Mark Zuckerberg money.
I saw that with Jim Banks when I was running against him in the U.S. Senate. They had an event in Seymour, Indiana, at Larison's, our local cafe, and his event was way in back, and they rushed him through the restaurant, so he couldn't meet regular Hoosiers. And on the way out, he scampered out without wanting to meet anyone. He just, it was just rushed in and rushed out. If you're going to be our senator, Jim, at least take the time to at least shake a few hands of the people in the restaurant you enter.
Exactly, because
what's wrong with that?
Exactly, because as a senator, you're supposed to represent the people of the state in the Senate. If you don't even meet them, how can you represent them?
Right. So, folks, we're out of time for this segment. When we come back, we're going to talk about an 80-year-old grandma from Ripley County voting for Diego because he handed her a paper plate. This is John Rust on the Radio. We will be right back. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on the Radio on Freedom 95, broadcasting all across the beautiful fruited plain of Indiana. Folks, I'm in the studio with Justin, the Redneck Republican. Welcome again, Justin.
Thank you so much, John.
So, folks, we're talking about Lincoln Day dinners, and before the break, I was talking about this. This was a meme on Twitter. And it has a picture of a 80-year-old grandma from Ripley County voting for Diego because he handed her a paper plate. And then the next line was, every state legislature terrified of Jim Banks endorsing his anonymous staffer. And it shows a big burly guard dog as the 80-year-old grandma voting for Diego, and a little toy poodle being terrified of Jim Banks, who's really a toy poodle himself.
Exactly. I think the takeaway from this should be is that at least the 80-year-old grandma, she's voting for a reason. She actually met Diego, and she actually had a good relationship with Diego. It's the person voting for England is just voting because they're scared of going against the Banks and Company. That's the takeaway.
Diego has put in the time going to Lincoln Day dinners for years and years now, handing out the paper plates.
Mm-hmm.
And so, folks, on Twitter, talking about Diego, there was a post recently. I'm going to read it in its entirety. It says, Secretary of State Diego Morales has issued a scathing text to Republicans calling out State Treasurer Daniel Elliott for calling on him to resign. Morales tried to paint Elliott as an ally of Indiana Senate President pro tempore Rod Bray and opposing of redistricting and President Trump. This is from Diego Morales. Over this Memorial Day weekend, while we are honoring the fallen and their sacrifice, State Treasurer Daniel Elliott, a close ally of Rod Bray, sent a blatantly false and politically motivated attack on me and my office for doing something nearly every Republican official in Indiana has done. The employee of my office that was the subject of Mr. Elliott's attack was cleared to work by the Indiana State Personnel Department HR Division. She was lawfully work authorized under state law. The agency that cleared her to work in my office handles background checks and work authorized verification for state agencies, including mine. And again, Diego goes on, thousands of state workers go through this process before they can even be hired. We follow the legal process and we follow the law, period. Anyone suggesting otherwise is either misinformed or deliberately misleading Hoosiers. You may ask why my office and myself are being targeted by political insiders and power brokers, and I believe the answer is clear. And again, this is from Diego Morales. I stood with President Trump and supported redrawing our congressional maps. while Treasurer Daniel Elliott stood with Rod Bray in opposition to the president and redrawing the maps. This is nothing more than political retribution for me, standing with our great president against those who fiercely opposed him. And again, this is from Diego Morales. Let me say this loud and clear. I will always choose to do what's right for the people of Indiana, and no political pressure or politically motivated attacks on me or my office will persuade me from doing what's right. Not now, not ever.
It was kind of strange to me how Morales was trying to paint Daniel Elliott as a ally of Rod Bray, because I know for a fact that Daniel Elliott endorsed Michelle Davis against Greg Walker in that primary. And see, Michelle Davis, she was the Trump
state senate.
State senate, that is correct.
In Columbus, Indiana, right, for that district.
Correct. And she was the Trump candidate. Greg Walker was the state senator who was in there, had voted no on redistricting. So Trump, like he did with all the rest of them, who said no, he endorsed their opponent, who said they would be pro redistricting. And in that race, it was Michelle Davis, and Daniel Elliott endorsed her.
So, folks, this is from Indy Politics, Abdul Hakim Shabazz. And this is from Twitter. It says, a deal to have Secretary of State Diego Morales to suspend his campaign ahead of the June 20th Republican State Convention was literally hours away from being finalized, according to multiple sources familiar with the discussions. And then the whole thing fell apart. The deal. Again, this is from Abdul Hakim Shabazz on Indy Politics. For much of the past week, sources told Indy Politics U.S. Senator Jim Banks and Attorney General Todd Rokita worked to broker an off-ramp for Morales. The pitch, sources say, was simple and straightforward. Avoid a convention floor fight. Let the party close ranks behind a consensus nominee and find Morales a soft landing on the back end. Sources say Morales came close to accepting. Again, folks, this is from Abdul Hakim Shabazz on Indy Politics. The consensus nominee Banks and Rokita had in mind, sources say, was Max Engling, Banks' Central Indiana Regional Director and Senior Advisor. Engling officially filed for the race the same day Banks and Rokita pulled their endorsements of Morales and threw their support behind him. The sticking point on Morales' end was the quote-unquote the landing. The job on the back end was a possibility, not a commitment, and the people working the back channel had trouble lining one up. Sources say Morales' reputation and his employment history complicated the search for a private sector position, and not without reason. The public records on Morales includes a 2011 discipline and resignation episode at the Secretary of State's office under Charlie White, and a disputed earlier exit from the office under then-Secretary Todd Rokita. And folks, remember, Todd Rokita either fired him directly or he resigned. I forget which. But Rokita endorsed Morales for Secretary of State until recently. He changed his mind. Folks, it's all just smoke and mirrors. You know, they don't care about anything other than their own elected offices and what their career paths are. Certainly not about Hoosier taxpayers. And I think in the end, that's why David Shelton is the absolute standout choice for all of them. Because yes, he may be boring, but he will get the job done, and not in a flashy way. You're not going to see the David Shelton State Fair. But he will get the job done in a way that I think all Hoosiers can be proud of.
Exactly, because David Shelton, when you look at all the other candidates, you know, whether Republican and the other party candidates, pretty much every single candidate has an ulterior motive for running besides just doing the job. And David Shelton is only running for the job just to do the job.
And folks, on the background of all this, for those who have never heard of what actually Diego has done, I'm going to read again from Abdul Hakim Shabazz's Indy Politics post on this. It says, throw in all the previous reporting on taxpayer-funded travel, vehicles, a six-figure branded vehicle history product, sexual harassment allegations from his time in office, and the hiring of family members into state positions, and most consequentially, the Can 2 Declaration of Candidacy forms his own office failed to properly notarize because staff members were not licensed notary publics, and oversight in the very office that issues notary licenses in Indiana. Folks, there was just a litany of things that happened under the Diego Morales administration that really called into question his competence to even do the job. But while all that was going on, Jim Banks and Todd Rokita were still endorsing him. Todd Rokita wrote him a check for $10,000.
Exactly, and I'm not going to say his name, but I had a guy on Twitter who was big with that whole camp. I was challenging him because he had endorsed Diego, and then as soon as England came in, immediately jumped ship to England. He's like, oh, well, it's called they're talking about the Elena Cupsey story. He's like, oh, it's called new information, analyzing the situation. And I'm like, dude, everybody who paid attention knew all of this stuff going on with Diego. And it's like, and his thing was, oh, but this one was the only one that had legal proof.
Well, they said
the problem is, where there's smoke, there's fire. With all this stuff all this stuff wouldn't have been coming out about Diego if there wasn't something going on. I mean, come on.
Well, in the end, what really took Diego down, at least in terms of the establishment, was they knew he would lose to Beau Bayh.
Exactly. That's why.
And Rob Kendall had wrote an opinion piece in the Indianapolis Star just the days before all this came out, calling this out. And Rob Kendall was roundly attacked for publishing that article by the establishment.
It was so shameless, too.
But then they admitted every charge of it by saying Diego has to go out. So they're saying, well, Rob's wrong, but he's right.
Exactly. It was so shameless the way he wrote the article. He got so viciously attacked for it. They're like, oh, we're so for Diego.
For speaking the truth and shaming the devil.
Exactly. And then not even, what was it, a week later was when England came in. I mean, and then all of a sudden completely jumping ship to England. I mean, it was ridiculous.
Okay, folks, we're out of time for this thing, but when we come back, we're going to keep talking about the Diego Morales candidacy for Secretary of State. This is John Rust on the Radio on Freedom 95. Stay tuned. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on the Radio on Freedom 95, broadcasting at 95.9 FM and 950 AM on your radio dial. Folks, in this show, we're talking about Diego Morales and his very corrupt handling of the Secretary of State's office. And what we're specifically talking about is how suddenly Todd Rokita, our Attorney General, and U.S. Senator Jim Banks have all of a sudden discovered that the person they endorsed wholeheartedly was a bad egg, and they needed to take him out. But guess what? They just want him to go away. They don't want to investigate the nuts and bolts of why all this is being talked about today. They just want Diego to be, figuratively buried in a cornfield somewhere. And I think that's why Diego's figured out he's going to hang on as long as he can, because he realized that being a friend of Jim Banks is nothing, because Jim Banks just stabbed him in the back on the endorsement, as he would do with anyone. Mm-hmm. But listen to this. This is from James Briggs, who works for the Indianapolis Star. He says, if Republicans are serious about this, and by this he means he's talking about the Diego Morales handling of the Secretary of State's office, Governor Mike Braun could call a special session and the Indiana General Assembly could impeach Diego Morales. And folks, that means they could remove him from office today if they really wanted to. The establishment could absolutely do that. But folks, they don't want the cat out of the bag. They don't want the curtain drawn and for all the dirty laundry to be aired in public.
Exactly, because let's face it, all this stuff that they say they have on Diego, I'm sure Diego has just as much on them as they do on him. So if, they know that they can't go too hard at Diego, because if they do, he might start airing out their dirty laundry, and they obviously they can't have that.
And that's where I think the delegates at the convention in Fort Wayne have to say, hey, wait a second, what's really going on? Because the delegates at the convention want someone who can beat Beau Bayh. They don't want just the shill who's being forced on them by the Banks campaign or by Rokita. They want someone who can actually beat Beau Bayh. And I think that's why David Shelton still has a great shot in all this, because the way, folks, the delegates cast their votes, I believe it really does mean David Shelton will probably win, in my opinion, because of how the votes are counted. There are 2 votes taken first where it's all candidates are included. So that today would be Diego Morales, David Shelton, Max Engling, and Jamie Rittenauer. After 2 votes, then they drop off the least popular candidate of all of them. And I'm not going to say who that will be. I don't know. But if you do the math on it, it will end up being Max Engling will be the establishment candidate, and David Shelton will be the grassroots anti-establishment candidate. And I believe David Shelton will win as the anti-establishment candidate, because that's what delegates want. They want someone that has the proven track record in office as a county clerk, handling elections, for a long time now, extremely competently. They want someone like that because that's someone who could beat Beau Bayh and take all of this Diego Morales controversy off the tables completely. If they do nominate Max Engling, the Diego Morales stuff will stay front and center because it's just one establishment stooge being replaced by another establishment stooge. It's one Jim Banks pick over another. Well, and I think also, folks, the delegates are going to realize that, hey, this guy the establishment is trying to force on us, he has been very unpopular in elections here in the state. In 2024, when Max Engling ran against Victoria Sparks, he came in third, after Chuck Goodrich, who came in with 33%. This Max Engling male model, he only came in at 9%, 9.7%.
Exactly. I just want to point out how horrible it is that this guy couldn't do any better than that against Victoria Sparks, Victoria Sparks herself, who in the 2026 primary almost lost to a guy by the name of Scott King. And Scott King, he had no campaign website, no social media presence, didn't even file a campaign finance report. And this guy came in, I believe it was 10 or 15 points over. And when you think about it, for an incumbent in your own party primary, that's absolutely pitiful. It was the same kind of deal with Shreve and Sarah Janice Brown.
And he lost his race for state delegate as well.
Exactly. I mean, if his own neighbors don't want him to be their representation at the convention, so why would we want him to be the winner of the convention? That's all I'm going to say.
Well, this is again from Rob Kendall. He says it's wild. There are 2 Indiana GOP Secretary of State candidates, Morales and Engling, who can't even vote for themselves at the convention because they got smoked in their own delegate races, unless, of course, county chairs appoint them to be delegates. Both of them, Diego Morales and Engling, were rejected by their own neighbors, but supposedly are the best people to lead our state. At least that's who the establishment wants to force on us. So, folks, that's where we're at on the Indiana Secretary of State's race as of today. We have 4 candidates. 2 are or were being forced on us by the establishment, and 2 not, Jamie Rittenauer and David Shelton. We can hope and pray that I think David Shelton has the chance to actually win this. So we will see where that goes. But folks, why I think David Shelton has a great chance. It's because they are so sick of what the establishment is doing to Indiana. This is from Jacob Stewart, folks. It says, why did Indiana's retirement system invest $1.7 million in Illinois bonds? This is an outrage. That's from Jacob Stewart, who is with the Indianapolis Star. Listen to this, again from Jacob Stewart. Illinois has an awful credit rating, and we get less than a 2% return on the bond. Justin, you said something earlier about Indiana becoming the new Illinois. Why on earth is our Republican state investing in Illinois? That is bizarre.
Exactly. Illinois is a failed state. Why?
And we're financing it. Why on earth?
I'll say again, the Indiana establishment GOP, they're nothing more than just they govern like liberal Democrats. They're literally investing in a liberal Democratic state. How much more proof do you need?
Well, it's because they're establishment and they want these cushy jobs that pay big money. Being a United States senator or congressman, you make $170,000 a year, but that's not all of it. But guess what, folks? You know what these rascals in Washington are doing today, Justin? Guess what?
What's that?
They are complaining that their $170,000 salary is too small for them to make a living.
Oh, good grief.
Even though they only work 140 days a year. So they could get a part-time job like a lot of Hoosiers. I know a lot of people that have 2 or 3 jobs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if it's so bad making $170,000 a year, maybe Jim Banks should get a job at McDonald's on the side.
Or Starbucks. You know how much you love Starbucks.
That's very correct. But folks, listen to this. GOP House Speaker Mike Johnson wants us to feel sorry for Congress members making $174,000 a year. You know, folks, you have to remember these people, you know, like Jim Banks and Aaron Houchin are the people that voted to block the release of the Epstein files. Remember, Jim Banks on November 10th, 2025 voted to block the release of the Epstein files. But you know what he tweets out about? This is from Senator Jim Banks. The porn industry has been complicit in child abuse and violence towards women while raking in billions. Obscenity laws are still good law. It's time to restart obscenity prosecutions and protect children online. Jim Banks, absolutely, and also those on Epstein Island. Why did you block the release of the Epstein files? You know, don't be such a hypocrite on this. Why did you block the release of the Epstein files if you're so concerned about children being abused?
He's only concerned about the politics and the way it looks.
Well, folks, next time you're buying groceries and can't believe how expensive it is, remember that congressional Republicans get $75 each and every day for food on top of their $175,000 salary, plus a large expense account and all the bribes they can carry. You know, that's you talking to me on Twitter, 100%. You know, this is from Adam Media One on Twitter. And he's talking about these congressmen who say we need to let them do insider trading to feed their families. That was the actual argument just made in defense of politicians trading stocks. Members of Congress make $174,000 a year. The median American income is $63,000 a year, 3 times less. Meanwhile, the federal minimum wage is at $7.25 an hour, also unchanged since 2009. And we're seriously being told politicians need access to insider trading to survive. You know, isn't that disgusting? You know, Congress, did you know, folks, they get $258 a day for lodging, $79 a day for food. That really brings their total salary to $234,000 a year.
You know, the majority of Americans couldn't even imagine making that much money and having that many benefits, and yet these people have the gall to say, "Oh, we can't hardly make it on our salary." It's like, what do you think the rest of America feels like?
Well, and the sad part is they're the ones making Americans poorer by what they do on their votes. Remember, the entire Indiana GOP delegation voted for trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of new debt just last year. Folks, that's $30,000 of new debt per taxpayer in the state of Indiana. So if you're driving down the road and you're hearing this and you're going to work, you have a $30,000 debt added to your shoulders thanks to Jim Banks, Todd Young, Aaron Houchin, all of them. They all voted for that. Well, and then Representative Jack Kimball, he actually said this, just a friendly warning. We don't even make $200,000 a year in Congress, despite working nearly 140 days. Is that a parody?
Sure,
if we aren't properly compensated, a lot of us will go into the private sector and you will get left with some real idiots in Congress. Folks,
I hate to tell them, I think there's already enough
they are
of them in Congress.
Already all idiots. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I hate to tell that guy, but I think that guy needs to look in the mirror a little bit.
You know, why couldn't they just do their jobs and do the tax cuts while cutting government spending? Instead, Jim Banks was voting for Joe Biden levels of government spending. That's not acceptable. We need conservatives in Congress, folks, not these pretend conservatives who vote so liberally.
Exactly. I think Jim Banks needs to change his name to Jim Bankruptcy because that's what he's doing to our country.
Exactly. Folks, we are out of time, but I want to thank you so much for listening. This is John Rust on the Radio. I'm going to close with my father's favorite Bible verse, Psalm 118, verse 24. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Folks, I'll see you all again next week on the radio.